This is Redline Prep, and we're going to get you up and running for the 2025 to 2026 policy debate topic with an early Arctic topic lecture. Make sure you like and subscribe as well. We'll be providing updates and content all season long. We are new and growing, so any engagement you can throw away is super appreciated. With that out of the way, let's explore the Arctic topic. As you know by now, the policy debate topic is resolved. The United States federal government should significantly increase its exploration and/or development of the Arctic. The Arctic is heating up, literally and politically. Climate change is resulting in massive amounts of ice melting, international borders are shifting, and every global superpower is taking a vested interest. Debates this year will focus on how the US is able to respond to all of that. Debaters should be prepared to debate environmental collapse, geopolitical power struggles, resource extraction, and Indigenous rights. This topic lecture will cover topic words, harms areas, solvency mechanisms, how this all works in the world of Trump, advantage areas, and finally, negative ground. Let's start with some topic words. There are some usual suspects, and then there are some more debatable interpretations of a few words. We're not going to go into depth and define every single word. Instead, we're going to give you the overview of the most debatable and contentious terms. First up is the annual and predictable return of the United States federal government, aka the USFG. There's not a lot that's new here. Debates that might happen with this term may center around whether or not particular affirmatives have to use certain branches to be topical. For example, on the economic inequality topic, the mechanism was fiscal redistribution, which could only be done by Congress, which meant any act that used the executive or judicial branches were untopical. The term USFG also is useful in counterplanned competition debates and against critical affirmatives, aka KFs, but those are whole other lectures that we'll be able to get into in the future. Next up is significantly increase. Stay with me here because it's going to be a little bit boring. The generic interp here is going to be to make greater in a meaningful way, but there are some limiting definitions. For example, U.S. Code Title 49, Section 41737E3 says that significantly increased costs are defined as a total unit cost increase of 10% or more over the compensation rate, sustained for at least 2 consecutive months. One could use this definition to say you have to increase exploration and/or development by 10%. We can go more in depth in a future lecture about how you would utilize this, but for the sake of time, we'll cut it there and discuss it later. Let's move on to exploration. At its core, exploration refers to the act of searching for the purpose of discovery. This can encompass a wide range of activities, from scientific research to resource prospecting. Let's get into the legal jargon. U.S. Code Title 30, Section 643 defines exploration in the context of mineral resources as the search for new or undiscovered deposits of minerals, including related development work conducted using recognized and sound procedures such as standard geophysical and geochemical methods. And U.S. Code Title 16, Section 2462, in the context of Antarctic mineral resources, exploration encompasses any activity, including logistical support, aimed at identifying or evaluating specific mineral resource deposits. This includes exploratory drilling, dredging, or other surface or subsurface excavations necessary to determine the nature and size of mineral resource deposits and the feasibility of their development. In scientific terms, exploration involves systematic investigation aimed at discovering new information. For instance, under this broad definition, apps could do climate research in the Arctic. In debate, the interpretation of exploration can significantly limit the scope of affirmative cases. A narrow interpretation focusing solely on physical resource prospecting might limit the affirmatives to activities like mineral or oil exploration. Conversely, a broader interpretation that includes scientific research and environmental studies could allow for a wider range of affirmative cases, such as climate research initiatives or biodiversity assessments in the Arctic. Now, let's look at development. The general interpretation of development generally refers to the process of growth, progress, or evolution. In the context of the Arctic, this could encompass economic, infrastructural, or technological advancements. There are a few legal terms and definitions that can help us understand this. California Government Code 66000 defines development as any project undertaken for the purpose of development, including the issuance of a permit for construction or reconstruction. This broad definition can encompass a wide range of activities, from building infrastructure to initiating new economic ventures. Secondly, U.S. Code Title 42, Section 6903, in environmental law, development activities that significantly contribute to an increase in mortality or increase in serious, irreversible, or incapacitating reversible illnesses are subject to regulation, highlighting the intersection of development and environmental health. Development can refer to the construction and improvement of foundational facilities and systems that support economic activities and enhance quality of life. This includes transportation networks, energy systems, and communication infrastructure. This interpretation of development, much like exploration, will be a limiting term in this year's resolution. A narrow interpretation might restrict cases to physical infrastructure projects such as building ports or roads. A broader interpretation could allow for initiatives like economic policy reforms, technological advancements, or community development programs in the Arctic region. Finally, let's explore the Arctic. Get it? Explore. Arctic? Topic words? Okay. Anyway, let's start with the geographical definitions. The Arctic is commonly defined as the area surrounding the North Pole, typically above the Arctic Circle. This region includes parts of 8 countries: the United States, only Alaska, Canada, Russia, Greenland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. Ecologically, the Arctic is characterized by its cold climate, unique ecosystems, and permafrost landscape. This region is home to diverse wildlife and is sensitive to environmental changes, making it a focal point for climate research. In debate, the definition of the Arctic will shape affirmative ground. Knowing where and what the Arctic is directly coincides with what the U.S. can do. For instance, the parts of the Arctic that are part of Canada can't be fiated by the USFG. That starts to wander into negative counterplan ground. A more strict geographical interpretation might limit cases to areas within the Arctic Circle, while a broader ecological or political interpretation could encompass adjacent regions and international waters. Thanks for sticking with us through those topic words. We know they can be kinda snoozers. If you're liking what you're hearing so far, our resource package will offer a copy of the Google Slides and script that you can use and edit, guided notes, and a class worksheet. See our links below if that interests you. For now, let's turn our attention to the harms areas. Geopolitically, we might think the Arctic is pretty boring. Why is there suddenly contention over frozen territory? First, we tariff penguins, and now we're debating the Arctic? What? The problem lies in the short-term future. Climate change will thaw out a lot of that area, and then it becomes a geopolitical hotspot. No pun intended. As Arctic ice recedes due to climate change, previously inaccessible areas are opening up, leading to increased interest in resource extraction, new shipping routes, and strategic military positioning. Think about the Titanic. It hit the ice, and we know the rest. But when the ice is gone, traffic through the Arctic becomes a whole lot easier. That's why everyone wants it. It's not just Trump being Trump. This area is geopolitically vital in the future. The Arctic is experiencing warming at a rate nearly 4 times faster than the global average temperature, a phenomenon known as Arctic amplification. This rapid change is transforming the region into a focal point for geopolitical competition among major powers, including the United States, Russia, and China. The melting ice is unveiling vast reserves of untapped natural resources such as oil, gas, and rare earth minerals, prompting nations to assert territorial claims and expand their military presence. Additionally, new maritime routes like the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage are becoming viable, offering shorter shipping lanes between continents and altering global trade dynamics. These developments are not only reshaping economic and environmental landscapes, but also raising concerns about sovereignty, security, and the potential for conflict in the Arctic region. In summary, the Arctic's transformation due to climate change is elevating its importance on the global stage, making it a critical area for strategic planning and international cooperation, or competition. Let's dive more into the area of climate change. It's going to be a significant harm on this topic. The Arctic is warming up faster than any other place. As Arctic sea ice melts, it exposes darker ocean surfaces that absorb more solar radiation, leading to further warming and ice melt, a feedback loop that accelerates climate change. This process contributes to rising global temperatures and disrupts established climate patterns. Thawing permafrost in the Arctic releases significant amounts of greenhouse gases such as methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. These emissions exacerbate global warming and can lead to the crossing of critical climate thresholds. Change is by far the biggest threat that humanity is facing right now. Currently, scientists estimate that global temperatures are 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Crossing the 1.5 to 2 degrees threshold is expected to trigger irreversible damage, including the collapse of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets. This would cause massive sea level rise, submerging major cities like New York, Miami, London, and Tokyo, and displacing over 1 billion people. Changes in the Arctic can influence weather patterns far beyond the region. The loss of sea ice and alterations in temperature gradients affect the jet stream, leading to extreme weather events like severe cold snaps, heat waves, and altered precipitation patterns in mid-latitude regions. In summary, climate change in the Arctic is not an isolated issue, but a global concern with far-reaching consequences. The region's rapid warming, melting ice, and permafrost thaw contribute to feedback loops that accelerate global climate change, disrupt weather patterns, and threaten ecosystems in human societies worldwide. The next harms area is the neglect of Indigenous rights. The Arctic is home to diverse Indigenous communities whose cultures, livelihoods, and identities are tied to the land and environment. However, these communities often face marginalization in decision-making processes related to Arctic development and climate policy. Climate change disproportionately affects Arctic Indigenous peoples, threatening their health, well-being, and self-determination. For example, the Sami in Russia experience significant mental health impacts due to stress and pressures that alter their traditional ways of life. Other stresses include development projects in the Arctic that frequently proceed without adequate consultation with Indigenous communities, leading to violations of their rights. The Arctic Council, for instance, has been criticized for denying its Indigenous members the right to vote on final proposals, undermining their ability to influence decisions that affect their land and lives. Legal battles have highlighted the struggle for Indigenous rights in the Arctic. In 2017, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in favor of the Inuit community of Clyde River, halting seismic testing for oil and gas exploration due to inadequate consultation, setting a precedent for Indigenous rights in environmental decision-making. Despite legal victories, challenges persist. In Norway, Sami reindeer herders continue to fight against wind farm developments that disrupt their traditional herding routes. Even after the Supreme Court ruled, such projects violated their rights. In summary, the neglect of Indigenous rights in the Arctic threatens the survival of many cultures. Ensuring meaningful participation and respect for Indigenous sovereignty is crucial for equitable and sustainable Arctic policies. If affirmatives choose to ignore this responsibility, it creates a very compelling counterplan and critique for the negative to utilize against them. Okay, so things are bad now, but what can we do about it? We're glad you asked. Let's turn our attention to possible solvency mechanisms. We're primarily coming at this from the affirmative's perspective, but there's plenty of counterplan ground here too. If you're watching this in class, now's a good time to pause, talk, and ask questions. Hit play when you're ready to get back to it, and like and subscribe so that you get notified when we drop new content. Let's start with our first solvency mechanism, deploying satellites. The Arctic's extreme environment presents unique challenges for monitoring and research. Not very many people want to go boots on the ground on a giant sheet of ice. To compensate, a combination of advanced technologies, including sensors, drones, submarines, and satellites, is essential for effective exploration and development. Satellites provide comprehensive coverage of the Arctic, enabling the monitoring of sea ice, weather patterns, and environmental changes. For instance, the NOAA's Joint Polar Satellite System. Trump has proposed gutting funding for this system, including a $1.3 billion cut targeting operations, research, and grants, and a $209 million cut specifically affecting weather satellites and infrastructure. These cuts have led to deferred maintenance and reduced support for JPSS satellites, potentially compromising the accuracy of weather forecasts. Next is drones. Drones offer flexibility and precision in Arctic research, capable of collecting high-resolution data in areas difficult to access by traditional means. NASA's deployment of the Vanilla drone, equipped with radar instruments, exemplifies the use of drones for measuring snow accumulation on sea ice. However, Trump has also proposed gutting this funding as well. The Trump administration's proposed budget includes a $6 billion cut to NASA's budget, with over $1 billion slashed from Earth science programs that track climate change. Despite these cuts, an affirmative could use drones to help understand and solve climate change through their capabilities. Negative teams would also do well to remember that all these funding cuts are solvency takeouts that can be utilized to say the affirmative can't be done. Drones aren't only useful for climate research, they're also key in security and defense. A potential advantage for this is deterrence and preventing Russia or other adversaries from dominating the Arctic. Drones have unique surveillance capabilities in military applications and can be easily used as weapons. An affirmative could increase deployment of drones to the Arctic or enhance their capabilities. Moving on to submarines. Submarines play a crucial role in exploring the Arctic's underwater geography, one of the few tools capable of gathering data beneath a solid ice cover. The U.S. Navy's ice exercise, ICE-X, is a primary example. ICE-X deploys fast attack submarines beneath the ice to collect environmental and acoustic data, map seafloor terrain, and conduct cold weather readiness drills. This supports both scientific understanding and military preparedness. However, the Trump administration's proposed 2026 defense realignment includes shifting Arctic submarine operations to focus on strategic deterrence rather than scientific dual-use missions. This change deprioritizes the environmental research role of ICE-X, potentially reducing Arctic data availability while raising tensions with Russia over military signaling in contested waters. This also means an affirmative aligned with military usage of submarines could avoid the Trump solvency deficit of this realignment. Affirmative plans could restore dual mission funding or direct ICE-X to resume environmental data collection protocols, increase submarine usage, or enhance submarine capabilities. On the NATO topic a few years back, there was an affirmative about integrating AI into submarines for defense. If I was debating on this topic, I would look back onto the NATO topics wiki and open case list for inspiration, because there's heavy overlap between these two topics. Okay, let's talk about sensors as a solvency mechanism. Sensors are the backbone of real-time environmental tracking in the Arctic. They provide on-the-ground, or under-the-ice, data that satellites and drones can't always capture, particularly when it comes to long-term ice behavior, melt rate, and subsurface temperature shifts. MIT Lincoln Laboratory's Arctic Climate Change Detection Network is a flagship example. This system uses a distributed network of sensors to track sea ice dynamics and alert researchers to sudden changes in Arctic conditions. But, like other science programs, it's on the chopping block. The Trump budget includes cuts to the Department of Energy and affiliated research institutions, funding that helps maintain climate sensor grids. Additionally, sensor upkeep has been hit by staffing shortages in regional areas, as NOAA and the DOE field offices face hiring freezes. AF plans here could center on restoring or expanding climate sensor infrastructure, reauthorizing specific lab partnerships, or creating federal grant programs for university-led Arctic sensor deployment. There are also military applications for sensors, like detecting adversaries or enemies, that could also be affirmatives as well. Let's talk about restoring or enhancing Arctic Council cooperation as a solvency mechanism. The Arctic Council, formed in 1996, remains a central intergovernmental body for coordinating policy among Arctic states and Indigenous nations. Its core mission centers on fostering cooperation in areas like environmental protection, sustainable development, and scientific research. Following Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the Council's operations were severely disrupted. The 7 Western Arctic nations temporarily suspended all Council activities involving Russia. Despite this breakdown, steps were taken to maintain function. In June 2022, the Western members began resuming limited project work without Russian involvement. By August 2023, all 8 Arctic states agreed to restart expert-level work through written procedural agreements. Norway's 2023 to 2025 chairmanship played a stabilizing role, though its agenda was narrowed to focus on climate, oceans, and Indigenous issues. Norway succeeded in keeping the Council intact. This continuity matters. The Arctic Council is one of the few diplomatic routes that enables coordinated scientific monitoring of a region now warming 4 times faster than the global average. However, cooperation remains fragile. The Trump administration has expressed skepticism about multilateral environmental bodies and multilateralism in general, characterizing them as inefficient or politically biased. During his first and second term, Trump withdrew the U.S. from several global forums, including the Paris Agreement, and was sharply critical of international science governance. A second Trump term could freeze Council participation altogether or significantly scale back U.S. funding and leadership in Arctic working groups. A clear affirmative plan here would be to reaffirm U.S. participation in the Arctic Council, safeguard funding for programs like AMAP, Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program, and PMAE, Protection of the Arctic Main Environment, and to propose new mechanisms to insulate Council operations from great power gridlock. Such a plan can stabilize governance, restore scientific collaboration, and ensure Indigenous voices remain central to Arctic decision-making. Now, let's talk about building renewable infrastructure. Several Arctic nations are turning to renewable energy to reduce dependence on imported fossil fuels and to cut carbon emissions. For instance, Norway invested $193 million into the Goliat project, a floating offshore wind farm in the Barents Sea intended to power the Arctic town of Hammerfest and offset emissions from oil and gas operations. In Canada, the Colic Energy Corporation is investing hydroelectric generation options near Nunavut as a replacement for aging diesel-powered systems. These projects highlight the growing feasibility of clean energy in Arctic contexts, particularly when national governments provide upfront investment. Renewable infrastructure also supports energy security, especially for Indigenous and isolated communities. However, you guessed it, Trump is including cuts to clean energy research, the Department of Energy's Arctic programs, and international climate partnerships. These reductions could weaken U.S. support for renewable innovation in every single area, and worsen climate change by relying on fossil fuels. A strong affirmative could propose restoring DoD Arctic energy grants and funding new renewable infrastructure projects. On the other hand, there could be building fossil fuel infrastructure as a solvency mechanism instead of renewable ones. Despite international climate goals, fossil fuel development in the Arctic is ongoing, most aggressively by Russia, whose Arctic policy centers on hydrocarbon extraction in shipping lanes like the Northern Sea Route. The Trump administration has echoed this model, promoting Arctic oil and gas leasing, including in previously protected areas like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. He's been pretty vocal about this, especially with his motto of drill baby drill. This solvency mechanism opens a path for affirmatives to increase fossil fuel infrastructure as a plausible plan under current federal priorities. The advantages could be economic growth and energy security, but it also increases exposure to disadvantaged links in Kritik ground, especially because of the downsides of increased fossil fuel use like climate change and Indigenous displacement. One of the most straightforward and best affirmative advantage areas on this topic is environmental protection or climate change. The Arctic is ground zero for climate change impacts, from melting sea ice to ecosystem destabilization. Any action that mitigates harms or slows feedback loops can generate compelling solvency and clear internal links to solving climate change. As we've discussed before, the region is warming nearly 4 times faster than the global average, contributing to sea level rise that cascades across the globe. Affirmative plans can mitigate these harms through several mechanisms. The first is reinstating or expanding funding for environmental agencies defunded under Trump. A few of these being NOAA, the EPA, and the Department of Energy's Arctic programs. The second is blocking fossil fuel development in ecologically vulnerable areas. The third is scaling up monitoring systems like satellites, drones, sensors, and submarines. And lastly, recommitting to scientific cooperation through the Arctic Council. Trump creates a uniquely hostile policy environment that strengthens uniqueness for disads as well as the brink arguments for climate change impacts. The worse the political status quo is, the more impactful the plan becomes. Okay, you're probably a little worried when it comes to Trump in the context of your plan, but there's ways around this. That's fiat. Affirmative teams should be prepared to defend durable fiat, the assumption that the plan is enacted even amid executive volatility. In this topic context, fiat isn't just theoretical, it's the mechanism that allows you to access advantages despite the Trump administration's obstructionism. Now, let's talk about soft power, the kind that doesn't come from weapons or oil, but from ideas, science, and credibility. Soft power is the ability of a country to influence others through persuasion and diplomacy, rather than coercion or force. In the Arctic, nations aren't just racing to claim territory, they're competing to set the narrative. Who gathers the data? Who leads the environmental reports? And who shows up to shape global standards? Right now, the US is falling behind. China calls itself a near-Arctic state and is investing in long-term research infrastructure, and Russia sends its military out as science vessels. Both are using research not just to learn, but to lead, to control what information circulates and who gets listened to on the world stage. Meanwhile, U.S. institutions like NOAA, NASA, and NSF have lost funding. Arctic monitoring programs have been scaled back. International cooperation under the Arctic Council has been stalled or degraded, and federal climate denial has undermined U.S. credibility and science diplomacy. The vacuum from U.S. leadership is being filled, and in global science, once you lose your seat at the table, it's hard to get it back. Especially with how volatile American politics are right now, countries don't exactly want to trust the U.S. when they're bouncing back and forth so violently between policies. Affirmative plans that restore research funding, relaunch international collaboration, or expand U.S.-led monitoring aren't just good policy, they reassert leadership. They send us a message that the U.S. still leads with facts. The kind of presence that builds trust, shapes norms, and earns long-term global influence without firing a shot. You're probably wondering about Trump again. I'm gonna say what I said before. Durable fiat solves, and you're gonna have to defend it as a mechanism, otherwise you're not gonna be able to get away with having your advantages. You can also explain that Trump is uniqueness for the AF and is the reason why the AF needs to happen as soon as possible, because Trump is pushing things like climate change and losing soft power to the brink. If soft power is about influence through ideas, this advantage is about maintaining strategic military presence and deterring rivals. The Arctic is no longer a frozen wasteland. Melting ice has made it a live theater for global competition. New sea routes, military choke points, and energy reserves have turned it into one of the world's most active geopolitical zones. Russia is building Arctic bases, deploying nuclear icebreakers, and militarizing key shipping routes like the Northern Sea Route. China is investing in Arctic ports, conducting dual-use expeditions, and positioning itself for long-term strategic access despite being thousands of miles away. The US, by contrast, has been slow to respond. Limited naval assets, outdated infrastructure, and an inconsistent Arctic policy have created a power vacuum, and when the US steps back, others step in. That's a problem, not just for the Arctic, but for global order. Allies begin to doubt US commitment, rivals see an opening, and the credibility of US deterrence takes a hit. A strong affirmative plan, whether it expands an icebreaker fleet, builds Arctic infrastructure, strengthens presence, or reinforces scientific leadership, signals that the US is still engaged. It builds deterrence, reassures partners, and pushes back on the narrative that the US is in retreat. There's a lot of evidence here that says this will help prevent wars with adversaries, because if they see an opening and a weakness in the US, they will try to start a war. This is especially important under a Trump presidency, where isolationism, NATO skepticism, and erratic foreign policy have strained alliances. The AF doesn't just fill the Arctic gap, it stabilizes US global leadership in an increasingly contested world and helps stabilize the world and ensure that conflict doesn't persist or escalate. Another strong affirmative angle on this topic is economic growth. The Arctic isn't just a geopolitical hotspot, it's also a region rich in untapped economic potential. From resource extraction to shipping routes to renewable energy installations, development in the Arctic can create jobs, generate revenue, and stimulate broader U.S. economic engagement. As climate change opens up the region, new trade corridors like the Northern Sea Route and expanded access to rare earth minerals, oil, and natural gas are reshaping global supply chains. At the same time, investing in Arctic infrastructure, ports, roads, energy grids, and research facilities can jumpstart industrial activity and increase U.S. competitiveness. Affirmative plans that promote Arctic development, especially those tied to public-private partnerships, green infrastructure, or innovation hubs, they inject money into the U.S. industries, creating high-skilled jobs in construction, energy, and tech, and improve America's long-term run on strategic investment. Here's the strategic context. Under the Trump administration, federal spending priorities shift heavily towards fossil fuels and deregulation, often at the expense of long-term planning or climate-resilient investment. That creates strong uniqueness for economic stagnation or infrastructure decay, and a clear opening for affirmatives to position themselves as pro-growth, pro-investment, and pro-future. You don't need to solve the whole economy, just show how Arctic investment can generate measurable growth regionally or nationally, and you'll be in a good spot. The Arctic isn't empty. It's home to hundreds of indigenous communities who have lived in and with the Arctic for generations. Long before nations drew borders or corporations drew up drilling plans, their ways of life are deeply tied to the land, the climate, and the patterns of the natural world. But that connection has often been ignored. Development projects in the Arctic, whether for fossil fuels, shipping lanes, or military infrastructure, has historically moved forward without consultation or consent. That erasure has material consequences: cultural displacement, disrupted food systems, rising suicide rates, and legal fights that go on for years. Affirmatives on this topic can flip that script. Plans that increase Arctic exploration or development in ways that center indigenous participation, such as co-managed infrastructure, community-led environmental monitoring, or workforce integration tied to development projects, create real, measurable empowerment. This can take the form of economic inclusion, capacity building within Arctic communities, and a greater control over how development impacts their land and future. It isn't just about representation. It's about restoring agency in a region where decisions are too often made without the people who actually live there. It also creates a strong moral framing for the AF, one grounded in equity, reparative justice, and lived experience. Under Trump, this becomes even more important. The rollback of tribal protections, weakened consultation requirements, and sidelighting of indigenous expertise during environmental reviews creates strong uniqueness for marginalization. The AF offers a clear contrast and a path forward. Strategically, this advantage links cleanly with environmental protection, climate adaptation, and infrastructure development, but can stand on its own as a distinct ethical and policy imperative. Think soft left if that's your brand of advantage. Okay, so we talked a lot about being AF, but let's give the neg some love too. The neg has real options on this topic too. The resolution is broad, which means the AF has lots of ground, but so do you. Whether you're a policy team, a critique team, or you're looking to abuse consult counterplans until someone begs for limits, there's plenty to work with. We'll break this into 3 parts: disadvantages, counterplans, and critiques. Okay, let's start with an overview of some disadvantages. Let's start with the China DA. The AF risks triggering Chinese backlash. Anything that expands U.S. presence in the Arctic, military assets, tech deployment, infrastructure control, can be framed as encirclement or exclusion. China's already sensitive to containment narratives, and the Arctic is now part of that map. Here's the uniqueness. U.S. pullback over the last few years left a power vacuum. China moved in, funding research bases, investing in ports, and pushing its near-Arctic state branding. Now they've carved out leadership. Any move to reassert U.S. dominance looks like a rollback. That triggers the link. What used to be leadership good now reads as a challenge to establish Chinese influence. You don't need troops to trigger this. Leadership restoration, multilateral cooperation without China, or even a US-led climate initiative can be framed as strategic displacement. That makes the AF a potential flashpoint in broader US-China competition, causing a US-China war. Next is the oil spill DA. The AF activates environmental risk. Any plan that builds infrastructure, boosts shipping traffic, or greenlights extraction increases the odds of an Arctic spill. The region's harsh conditions make cleanup nearly impossible. Once it leaks, it stays there. The uniqueness argument isn't that great, because melting ice and new drilling zones mean that environmental catastrophe is kinda already happening now, and which means that it's not solely the AF's fault. You'll have to find evidence saying that there's been less oil spills, and that one more accident tanks biodiversity, devastates local communities, and fuels feedback loops that'll accelerate global warming. The link is pretty good though, since oil spills are baked into exploration and development. Let's talk about the trade-off disad. Arctic plans come with a price tag, and they drain serious bandwidth. The federal budget isn't infinite, and any serious Arctic initiative pulls money, time, focus, and political capital away from other high priority areas. The uniqueness now? Tight margins, fiscal gridlock, and competing priorities. For example, the CHIPS Act still needs to be implemented, the Inflation Reduction Act is struggling to deploy climate funding, and Pacific deterrence versus China is under-resourced. Disaster prep at home is already underfunded, and Congress is one spending fight away from another debt ceiling standoff. Every dollar you send to the Arctic is a dollar you don't send somewhere else. That trade-off doesn't just risk delay, it risks collapse of key domestic and foreign policy agendas. The impact here will vary depending on what area you decide to say the trade-off will be bad for. There's lots of counterplan ground on this topic. Most counterplans fall into one of two camps. One is change the actor. These counterplans shift the plan away from the US federal government. You're not saying the goal is wrong, you're saying the agent messes it up, and that a different agent will do it better. Here's some of our ideas. First is the Arctic Council. You can say multilateralism solves better. Let the Council coordinate Arctic action, especially on science or environmental action. You avoid US overreach, gain legitimacy, and dodge unilateralism links. Next is the Consul counterplan. This counterplan requires prior approval from indigenous nations or foreign allies. You get a process net benefit. Delay equals stability, consent equals legitimacy, and access uniqueness for backlash, politics, or power sharing. Next is the private sector/FDI counterplan. Let companies or foreign investors handle it. They're faster, cheaper, and don't trigger government inefficiency or budget trade-offs. The bonus is it solves perception links and avoids federal fiat altogether. The next counterplan is having another country do the plan instead, like China or Russia. You'll get to say that their leadership in the Arctic is good for some reason or another, while also getting to say that US leadership is bad in that area. The next type of counterplan changes the method. These counterplans keep the US federal government as the actor, but flips how the plan gets done. First is the agency coordination counterplan. Don't reinvent the wheel. Have NOAA, the NSF, DoD, or DOE coordinate through existing mandates. It beats having a new program, avoids redundancy, and helps with federalism or duplication disads. Next is the Indigenous Empowerment Counterplan. This shifts leadership to tribal governments or Arctic communities using current consultation frameworks. It wins offense on equity, checks paternalism, and flips the AF's moral high ground. Also hits back against settler colonialism links. We also have some pretty good critique ground on this topic. Pick your lens, press the link, and control the framing. There are three main angles that hit consistently under this topic. First is settler colonialism or epistemic violence. The AF assumes the US has the right to act in the Arctic, to explore it, develop it, regulate it, or save it. That's the root problem. Even well-meaning plans reproduce the logic of ownership over indigenous land, knowledge, and governance. Whether they consult or not, they still position the federal government as the actor with the final say. This K hits the hardest against AFs that claim empowerment while keeping colonial structures untouched. If the plan relies on inclusion rather than transformation, you have ground. The ballot isn't just about policy, it's about disrupting the logic that makes Arctic domination seem natural and necessary. Next is the anthropocentrism or environmental ethics K. The AF sees the Arctic as a tool, a space to manage, monitor, or extract from. That framing centers humans' interests over ecosystems and treats nature as either a resource or a crisis to solve. Even environmental AFs fall into this trap, especially when they rely on tech, data, or development to fix nature. This K links to exploration, extraction, satellite use, and even conservation framed in terms of human benefit. You're not just saying the AF is wrong, you're saying the framework for evaluating the Arctic is the problem. Lastly is the securitization/militarization critique. When the AF frames the Arctic as a strategic zone, or even just a space the US needs to control, it locks the region into national security logic. That means more surveillance, more military buildup, and more justification for force, whether it's in the form of icebreakers, sensors, or base construction. Even AFs that don't mention the military link, just calling the Arctic vulnerable or contested invites state-centered responses that marginalizes both ecosystems and indigenous governance. This K is great against monitoring AFs, soft power AFs, and anything that leans on deterrence or presence for its affirmative advantage. That wraps up our Arctic topic overview. Key terms, AF lanes, net ground, and everything in between. Whether you're cutting cards, writing blocks, or just trying to figure out what significantly increase actually means, you've now got a solid launch pad. We'll be back soon with deep dives on case areas, counterplan theory, and more specific strategy prep. If this helped, hit like and subscribe. It's a small click for you and a giant uniqueness boost for us. Thanks for rolling with Redline Prep. See you next lecture.